The notorious Red Scorpions motorcycle gang thought they had found an easy target in the quiet fields of rural Nebraska. What they didn't know was that Shadow Creek Farm belonged to former Marine Force Recon Captain James "Iron" Morrison, a decorated veteran who had spent 15 years turning hostile territories into hunting grounds. They were about to learn why you don't threaten a farmer who was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind swept across the vast cornfields as James Morrison surveyed his land from the worn wooden porch of his farmhouse. At 38, his weathered face and calloused hands told two stories. One of a decorated warrior who had served 6 brutal tours in some of the world's deadliest combat zones, and another of a third-generation farmer who had returned home to tend his family's legacy. The last rays of sunlight painted the Nebraska sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple as James finished his evening routine, checking the locks on his barn and equipment sheds. His farm sat on 200 acres of prime agricultural land, passed down through generations of Morrisons. The property featured rolling cornfields, a large red barn that had stood for over 70 years, 3 equipment sheds, and a modest 2-story farmhouse that James had recently renovated with his own hands. 6 months had passed since he'd returned home to take over the farm after his father's passing. The transition from military life to farming had been smoother than expected. The discipline, attention to detail, and strategic planning required in farming weren't so different from his military training. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet farmer who kept to himself, always polite but reserved. None of them knew about the Silver Star and Bronze Star medals carefully stored away in his attic, or the classified operations he'd led across 3 continents. The familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance caught his attention. Over the past few weeks, he'd noticed increasing biker activity along the county road that bordered his eastern fields. At first, he'd paid it little mind. Public roads were public roads. But his combat-honed instincts had started picking up on patterns. The bikers always appeared after sunset, usually in groups of 3 to 5, and they'd recently begun stopping along the field's edge. James moved silently across his property, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. Old habits died hard. From behind a stack of hay bales, he observed 3 bikes parked near his fence line. Their riders were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones and gesturing toward his back 40 acres where the land dipped into a secluded valley. Even in the dimming light, he could make out their colors: black leather vests with a blood-red scorpion patch. "Perfect spot," he heard one say, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Remote, lots of coverage, and old man Morrison's kid won't know what hit him." James allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it probably wouldn't be the last. He memorized their faces, bike models, and the distinctive modifications on each motorcycle. Intelligence gathering was second nature after years of reconnaissance missions. As the bikers mounted their machines and roared away, James pulled out his phone and snapped several photos of their departure. Back in his house, he opened his laptop and began a detailed log entry: dates, times, descriptions, and potential threats. In the Marines, he'd learned that proper intelligence was often the difference between victory and defeat. That night, as James sat at his kitchen table cleaning his father's old shotgun, he reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd returned to Shadow Creek Farm seeking the peace and quiet of rural life, hoping to leave behind the violence and conflict of his military career. But watching the sun set over his cornfields that evening, he knew his quiet farming life was about to become considerably more interesting. The rumble of distant motorcycles echoed once more across his land. James chambered a shell in the shotgun and set it aside. He wouldn't need it, not yet. First, he would watch, wait, and plan. After all, that's what Force Recon had taught him: gather intelligence, understand your enemy, and prepare the battlefield. These bikers were about to learn a harsh lesson about threatening a farmer who had spent his military career teaching much more dangerous enemies the cost of underestimating him. Over the next week, James Morrison settled into a careful routine of observation and preparation. Each evening after finishing his farm work, He would position himself at different vantage points around his property, documenting the Red Scorpion's increasing activities. His military training had taught him the value of patience and thorough reconnaissance. The bikers were growing bolder. Their numbers had increased from 3 to 7, and they now made regular stops along his eastern fence line. Through his high-powered binoculars, the same ones he'd used on countless missions overseas, James watched them marking locations on maps and taking photos of his property. Whatever they were planning, it was clear they intended to use his land for something illegal. One particularly cool evening, James crouched behind an old tractor near his eastern field, his dark clothing blending perfectly with the deepening shadows. The sun had just set, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when he heard the distinctive rumble of approaching motorcycles. "This is the spot," a gruff voice announced as 5 bikes pulled up to his fence line. James recognized the speaker from his previous observations. A tall, heavily built man with a gray beard and a distinctive scar running down his left cheek. The others called him Razor. "Old farmer won't know what hit him," another biker chuckled, his leather vest bearing sergeant-at-arms patches. "Valley's perfect for our operation. Remote, hard to spot from the main road, and plenty of escape routes through the back country." James silently pulled out his phone, recording their conversation. His years in Force Recon had taught him the value of gathering evidence before taking action. Through his binoculars, he watched as Razor spread a map across one of the bike's seats. "We'll need to clear about 10 acres, Razor explained, pointing to different areas. "The valley provides natural coverage, and these cornfields will help hide our activities. Once we're set up, this'll be the biggest operation we've ever run." "What about Morrison?" a younger biker asked. "Heard he's some kind of ex-military." Razor laughed dismissively. "Just another farmer playing soldier. Probably some desk jockey who never saw real action. Besides, by the time he figures out what's happening, it'll be too late." James allowed himself a small smile. He'd heard similar dismissals before, usually from opponents who didn't live long enough to regret their mistake. As the bikers continued their planning, he carefully memorized names, faces, and details of their operation. Suddenly, a branch snapped nearby. James froze, his training kicking in as he controlled his breathing, and remained perfectly still. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping past his position. "Thought I heard something," one of the bikers called out, moving closer to James's hiding spot. "Probably just some wildlife," Razor replied. "But check it out anyway. Can't be too careful." 2 bikers approached the tractor, their boots crunching on the dry cornstalks. James didn't move a muscle, using the techniques he'd learned in countless combat situations. The flashlight beam passed within inches of his position, but the shadows and his careful positioning kept him hidden. "Nothing here," one of the bikers reported after a few tense moments. "Just an old piece of farm equipment." "Let's wrap this up," Razor ordered. "Tomorrow night we'll bring the whole crew. Time to show this farmer who really owns this territory." As the bikers mounted their machines and roared away, James remained motionless for several more minutes, ensuring they were truly gone. Finally, he moved from his position, his joints stiff from the prolonged stillness, but his mind sharp and focused. Back in his house, James reviewed the evidence he'd gathered. The Red Scorpions were planning something big, and they intended to use his land whether he agreed or not. From their conversation, he gathered they planned to set up some kind of large-scale operation in the valley, likely drug-related given their reputation. Opening his laptop, he added the night's intelligence to his growing file. Names, descriptions, bike details, and snippets of conversation. Everything that might prove useful. In the Marines, he'd learned that information was often the best weapon. As he worked, James heard the distant rumble of motorcycles passing on the main road. "Tomorrow night," they'd said. Tomorrow night they would bring their whole crew, thinking they would intimidate a simple farmer into submission. James walked to his window, looking out over his darkened fields. He'd spent 15 years in Force Recon, conducting operations in places where the wrong move meant death. These bikers thought they were predators, but they had no idea what it meant to truly hunt and be hunted. Tomorrow night would come, but the Red Scorpions would find that shadow. Creek Farm was far from the easy target they imagined. James Morrison hadn't earned his silver star by backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to let a gang of thugs threaten the land his family had worked for generations. Looking at his father's shotgun mounted above the fireplace, James began to plan. The valley they coveted so much would indeed become a perfect spot, not for their operation, but for teaching them why some farmers were best left alone. The next day dawned clear and crisp as James Morrison began implementing his carefully crafted plan. While maintaining his normal farming routine, to avoid arousing suspicion, he strategically prepared his property for the confrontation he knew was coming. Every moment between his regular farm work was spent setting the stage for tonight's inevitable encounter. James drove his tractor across the eastern fields, apparently tending to his crops. But with each pass, he was actually marking positions and creating subtle paths that would serve his purposes later. He'd learned in Recon that the best tactical advantage often came from preparing the battlefield while the enemy was watching. Around mid-afternoon, a lone motorcycle cruised slowly past his property. James recognized the rider, one of Razor's scouts doing preliminary surveillance. The former Marine kept his head down, seemingly absorbed in his work, while actually noting every detail of the scout's behavior. Just as he'd expected, the Red Scorpions were monitoring his movements, trying to establish his routine. Time to give them something to watch, James muttered to himself. He purposefully drove his tractor back to the barn, making it appear as though he was finishing his day's work early. In reality, he was setting the first phase of his plan in motion. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, James moved through his property with practiced stealth, placing small LED markers in strategic locations, invisible during daylight but crucial for his night operations. He'd used similar tactics during midnight raids in combat zones, and now these skills would serve to protect his home. In the valley that the Red Scorpions coveted, James made careful preparations. He positioned old farm equipment to create choke points, rolled hay bales to provide both cover and obstacles, and strategically parked his tractor to control access to the area. To untrained eyes, it all looked like normal farm activity. But James was creating a complex tactical environment that he could navigate blindfolded. "Proper planning prevents poor performance," he whispered his old commander's favorite saying as he worked. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in combat, and now it would serve him well on his own land. Just before sunset, James noticed increased motorcycle traffic on the main road. The Red Scorpions were staging their people nearby, preparing for their show of force. He counted at least 15 bikes passing by in small groups, more than he'd anticipated, but nothing he couldn't handle. Inside his house, James changed into dark clothing that would blend with the evening shadows. He checked his equipment: night vision monocular, radio scanner tuned to pick up the bikers' frequencies, and his phone set to record video. He wouldn't carry any weapons. He didn't need them. His skills and the environment he'd prepared would be enough. As darkness fell, James activated his hidden LED markers using a remote control. To his trained eye, they created a grid pattern across his property, helping him navigate and coordinate his movements. He positioned himself in the barn's hayloft, which offered a perfect view of the valley approach. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as night settled over Shadow Creek Farm. Through his night vision monocular, James watched as the Red Scorpions arrived in force. 20 bikes in total, their riders confident and aggressive, pulled up along his fence line. Razor led them, his scarred face visible in the moonlight. "Spread out," Razor commanded. "Search the house and barn, find Morrison, and make sure he understands exactly who he's dealing with." James allowed himself a grim smile. The Red Scorpions were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating their opponents. As the bikers split into groups and began moving onto his property, James keyed his radio scanner, listening to their communications. "House looks empty," one group reported. "Checking the barn now," another called in. "Keep your eyes open," Razor's voice crackled over the radio. Something doesn't feel right. James had to admire Razor's instincts. Something indeed wasn't right, but by the time they figured it out, it would be too late. The former Force Recon captain reached for his phone and typed out a pre-written text message to the county sheriff. "Shadow Creek Farm. Multiple trespassers. Evidence gathering in progress." Below him, 3 bikers entered the barn, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. James remained perfectly still in the hayloft, watching them move exactly where he wanted them. Years of combat experience had taught him the value of patience. The red scorpions thought they were hunting him, but in reality, they were walking right into his carefully prepared trap. 3. The night was about to become very interesting indeed. James watched silently from his elevated position as the 3 bikers moved deeper into the barn. Their flashlight beams swept across old farm equipment and stacked hay bales, creating dancing shadows on the weathered wooden walls. Years of tactical operations had taught him that the best moment to strike was when the enemy felt most in control. "Nothing up here," one biker called out, his voice echoing in the large space. "Just farm junk and hay." "Check the loft," another ordered, shining his light upward. But James had already moved, sliding silently through the shadows to a position behind a stack of hay bales. The beam passed through the empty space where he'd been moments before. "Morrison!" the 3rd biker shouted. "We know you're here somewhere. Make this easy on yourself." James pressed a button on his remote control, and suddenly the barn's old ventilation fans roared to life. The unexpected noise startled the bikers, causing them to spin around, momentarily disoriented. In that instant of confusion, James made his move. Dropping silently from the loft behind them, he landed without a sound, a technique perfected during countless night operations. Before the bikers could react, he reached up and pulled the main barn door shut, the heavy wooden barrier sliding closed with a resonant boom. "What the hell?" one biker exclaimed, spinning around. In the dim light, all they could see was James's silhouette, standing calmly between them and the exit. "Evening, gentlemen," James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the fan noise. "I believe you're trespassing." The largest biker charged forward, swinging a heavy chain. James stepped aside smoothly, using the man's momentum against him. A simple redirect sent the biker crashing into a stack of empty feed barrels. The noise echoed through the barn like thunder. The second biker pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. "You're dead, farmer," he snarled, slashing wildly. But James had faced far more skilled opponents in combat. He moved like water, avoiding each attack while maneuvering the biker exactly where he wanted him. "The thing about fighting in a barn," James commented calmly, ducking another wild swing, "is knowing your environment." With that, he swept the biker's legs, sending him sprawling into a pile of loose hay. The man's curse was cut short as he discovered the hay concealed a shallow depression, effectively trapping him. The 3rd biker, showing more sense than his companions, reached for his radio. "Razor, we need backup in the—" His call for help was interrupted as James calmly plucked the radio from his hand. "No one's coming to help," James informed him, crushing the radio under his boot. "Your friends outside are about to have problems of their own." As if on cue, shouts of confusion could be heard from outside. James had positioned his irrigation sprinklers to create muddy patches in strategic locations. The sound of motorcycles revving followed by cursing suggested his trap was working perfectly. The first biker had untangled himself from the feed barrels and was approaching more cautiously now. "You're just one man," he growled. "There's 20 of us." James smiled in the darkness. "In Force Recon, they taught us that numbers don't matter nearly as much as preparation and skill." Without warning, he reached up and pulled a rope, releasing a cascade of hay bales that separated the bikers from each other. "And I've had plenty of time to prepare." Moving with practiced efficiency, James disabled each biker in turn. No brutal violence, no unnecessary force, just precise strikes and holds that left them gasping and immobilized. Within minutes, all 3 were secured with their own belts and bandanas. "Now," James said, collecting their phones and remaining radio. "Let's go see how your friends are doing." Outside, chaos had erupted. The Red Scorpions had discovered that Shadow Creek Farm was far from the easy target they'd imagined. Bikes were stuck in strategically placed mud pits. Riders were tripping over hidden guide wires, and the carefully positioned farm equipment had turned the valley approach into a maze that split their forces apart. James moved through the darkness like a ghost, using his LED markers to navigate while the bikers stumbled blindly. One by one, he separated them from their groups, disabled their bikes, or led them into prepared traps. His night vision monocular gave him a perfect view of their confusion and growing fear. "He's everywhere!" one biker shouted, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. The shot went wide, hitting nothing but air. "Hold your fire, you idiots!" Razor's voice boomed out. "Regroup at the road. Something's not right here." But regrouping wasn't an option. James had designed his defensive layout specifically to prevent the bikers from reuniting their forces. Every escape route led to another trap. Every attempt to gather led to further separation. It was like trying to fight a shadow that knew every inch of the battlefield. Through it all, James's phone recorded everything: the weapons, the threats, the attempted invasion of his property. When the sheriff arrived, there would be no doubt about who the aggressors were. The night was still young, and James Morrison was just getting started. The Red Scorpions were about to learn why some farms were better left alone, and why some farmers carried skills far deadlier than any biker gang could imagine. Through his night vision monocular, James watched as the remaining Red Scorpions struggled to regroup. Their once confident formation had dissolved into chaos, with small groups of bikers stumbling through his carefully prepared battlefield. His farm had become a tactical maze, and he was the only one who knew the way through it. "Find him," Razor's voice carried across the darkness, tinged with growing frustration. "He's just one man." The gang leader stood near the road, trying to maintain control of his increasingly scattered forces. James counted 12 bikers still mobile, with the rest either trapped, separated, or dealing with disabled motorcycles. Moving silently through his cornfield, James activated another set of his prepared defenses. The irrigation system suddenly burst to life, spraying powerful jets of water across key areas. The unexpected deluge caught several bikers off guard, sending them slipping in the newly created mud and effectively cutting off another escape route. "This ain't natural," one biker shouted, his leather boots sliding in the muck. "It's like the whole farm's fighting us." James allowed himself a small smile. In Force Recon, they'd taught him that psychological warfare was often as effective as physical confrontation. Every noise, every unexpected obstacle, every moment of confusion was carefully calculated to break down the bikers' confidence. Through his radio scanner, he listened to their increasingly panicked communications. "Can't get my bike started." "Where's Mike's group?" "Something's moving in the corn." "This is all wrong, Razor. We should pull out." Razor's response crackled through the radio. "Nobody leaves. Find Morrison and teach him what happens when you mess with the Red Scorpions." James keyed his phone's flashlight 3 times, a signal to the sheriff's deputies he knew were quietly taking up positions along the perimeter of his property. He'd timed everything perfectly, letting the gang get deep enough into his trap before law enforcement arrived. Moving to his next position, James spotted 4 bikers trying to flank his barn. They were moving more cautiously now, having learned from their companions' mistakes. But caution wouldn't save them from what was coming next. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote control. With one press of a button, the powerful floodlights he'd mounted on his grain silo blazed to life, temporarily blinding the bikers who had become accustomed to the darkness. In their moment of confusion, he struck. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as James moved among them like a shadow. A quick strike to pressure points, a precise joint lock, a swift leg sweep. Each movement was economical and effective. Within moments, all 4 bikers were on the ground, groaning and disarmed. What are you?" one of them gasped as James zip-tied his hands. "Just a farmer protecting his land," James replied calmly, collecting their weapons and phones. "Though I did pick up a few useful skills in Force Recon." Razor's voice suddenly boomed from nearby. "Morrison, show yourself. Let's settle this man to man." James checked his watch. The timing was perfect. The sheriff's deputies would be in position by now, and he had more than enough evidence recorded. But there was still one final lesson to teach. Moving to the edge of his cornfield, James spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry. You brought 20 men to threaten one farmer, Razor. Doesn't seem very sporting. Says the man hiding in the dark, Razor shouted back. Face me if you've got the guts. James clicked his radio twice, a signal to the deputies to hold their positions. This confrontation needed to end the right way, with Razor understanding exactly why he'd failed. You know what the difference is between us, Razor? James called out, his voice calm and controlled. You see this land as something to take. I see it as something to protect. And I've spent 15 years learning how to protect things from much worse than you. With that, James emerged from the cornfield into the illuminated area. He stood relaxed but ready, empty hands visible at his sides. Razor faced him, still trying to project confidence despite his scattered forces and failed invasion. Big mistake, Morrison, Razor growled, pulling out a heavy chain. Should have stayed hidden. James shook his head slightly. No, Razor. Your big mistake was thinking that the most dangerous thing on this farm was your gang. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. Razor swung his chain, but James was already moving. Years of combat experience flowed through every motion as he disarmed the gang leader with surgical precision. A series of swift strikes left Razor gasping on his knees, his weapon lying useless in the mud. How? Razor managed to wheeze. Force Recon, James replied simply. We're the ones they send in when they need to handle things quietly, and you brought your gang to my backyard. Police lights suddenly flooded the area as sheriff's vehicles pulled up to the property. Deputies emerged with weapons drawn, but there was little resistance left to face. The Red Scorpions' attempted takeover of Shadow Creek Farm had ended, not with a bang, but with their leader kneeling in the mud, finally understanding just how badly they'd misjudged their target. The next morning, Shadow Creek Farm was quiet once again, showing little evidence of the previous night's confrontation. James Morrison stood on his porch, sipping coffee, as Sheriff Mike Wheeler's patrol car pulled up the gravel driveway. The sheriff was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen his share of trouble. Quite a night, Sheriff Wheeler said, climbing out of his car. We've got 16 Red Scorpions in custody, including Razor. Found enough weapons in their bikes to arm a small militia. Want to tell me how one farmer managed to take down the most notorious bike gang in 3 counties? James smiled slightly, offering the sheriff a cup of coffee. Just got lucky, I guess. Right place, right time. Lucky? The sheriff raised an eyebrow. My deputies found them scattered across your property like bowling pins. Some trapped in mud, others tied up in your barn, and their leader looking like he'd gone 10 rounds with a professional fighter. That's not luck, son. That's training. They walked together across the property, surveying the aftermath. Several deep tire tracks marked where bikes had gotten stuck, and the irrigation-soaked ground was churned up from the struggle. James had already begun resetting his defensive preparations, though he doubted any other gangs would try their luck after last night. Razor's singing like a bird, the sheriff continued. Turns out they were planning to set up a major drug operation in your valley. The Red Scorpions have been doing this for years, forcing farmers off their land to use remote properties for their business. You're the first one who ever stood up to them. James nodded, remembering the intelligence he'd gathered over the past weeks. They made a lot of assumptions. Thought because I was just a farmer, I'd be an easy target. About that, Sheriff Wheeler pulled out a notepad. Did some checking after last night. 3 tours with Force Recon, Silver Star, Bronze Star, classified operations across 3 continents. You're not exactly your average farmer, are you? Not anymore, James admitted. But this is what I want now. Peace, quiet, and my family's land. He looked across his fields, the morning sun painting the cornfields gold. I just wanted them to leave me alone, the sheriff chuckled. Well, they'll definitely do that now. Word's already spreading about what happened here. They're calling you the ghost farmer in the holding cells. Some of them are still shaking, talking about how you seem to be everywhere at once. James shrugged. Just used what I learned in the Marines. Preparation, timing, and using the environment to your advantage. The DA wants to talk to you, Sheriff Wheeler said. Between your video evidence and the weapons we recovered, the Red Scorpions are looking at some serious time. Razor's already offering to plea bargain, trying to save himself. They reached the barn where James had stored the confiscated bikes. The sheriff whistled at the collection of expensive motorcycles. County will probably auction these off once the case is closed. Might be some good comes out of this, money for the schools maybe. As long as they're not used for causing more trouble, James replied. Oh, I don't think we'll have trouble around here for a while, the sheriff grinned. Story's already making the rounds. Nobody's going to want to mess with the farmer who took down the Red Scorpions single-handed. As they walked back to the patrol car, Sheriff Wheeler turned serious. You know, we could use someone with your skills on the force. Deputy positions opening up next month. James shook his head, smiling. Appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm done with that life. All I want now is to tend my fields and live in peace. Can't blame me for trying, the sheriff chuckled, climbing into his car. But if you ever change your mind, I'll let you know, James promised. Meanwhile, I've got crops to tend. As the patrol car disappeared down the dusty road, James looked out over his property. The morning sun revealed the full extent of last night's chaos. Churned earth, scattered equipment, and the deep tracks of motorcycles that would never return. But beneath the surface damage, Shadow Creek Farm stood strong, protected by a farmer who had proved that sometimes the quietest men were the most dangerous. James picked up his work gloves and headed toward his tractor. The fields wouldn't plow themselves, and he had a lot of work to do. But for the first time since returning home, he felt truly at peace. The Red Scorpions had taught him something important, that protecting his land didn't mean leaving his old skills behind, but rather finding a new way to use them. As he started the tractor's engine, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. Shadow Creek Farm was more than just land. It was his home, his legacy, and now, his own personal victory. The ghost farmer had earned his peace, and he intended to keep it. 2 weeks after the Red Scorpions incident, life at Shadow Creek Farm had settled back into its quiet routine. James Morrison was working in his cornfield, the late afternoon sun warm on his shoulders, when he noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck approaching along his gravel driveway. His combat-honed instincts automatically noted details: newer model Ford, mud-splattered wheels, Nebraska plates. The truck came to a stop, and an elderly man stepped out, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. James recognized him from photographs in the local paper. Frank Wilson, owner of the largest farm in the next county. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of decades working the land. "Mr. Morrison," Wilson called out, his voice carrying across the field. "Got a minute to talk?" James parked his tractor and walked over, studying the older man. Wilson's farm was nearly 5 times the size of Shadow Creek, and rumors said he'd been fighting his own battles with biker gangs for months. "What can I do for you, Mr. Wilson?" James asked, offering his hand. Wilson's grip was still firm despite his age. "Thought it was time we met, son. Heard what you did with the Red Scorpions. Whole county's talking about it." They walked together toward James's porch, where a pitcher of cold lemonade waited. Wilson settled into one of the old wooden chairs, his cane resting against the railing. 3 months ago, Wilson began, accepting a glass of lemonade, "the Demon Raiders tried to force me off my land. Same approach as the Red Scorpions: intimidation, threats, property damage. Sheriff couldn't do much without evidence. Last week, they suddenly pulled out. Know why?" James shook his head, though he had a suspicion. "Word got around about what happened here," Wilson continued. "About a farmer who turned his land into a trap for those who meant harm. The ghost farmer, they're calling you, made some people rethink their strategies." "I just protected what was mine," James replied simply. Wilson nodded. "That's why I'm here. Got 15 farming families in the county facing similar problems. Bikers, criminal organizations, land developers using strong-arm tactics. We need someone who can teach us how to protect ourselves." James sat back, considering. "I'm not looking to start a war, Mr. Wilson." "Neither are we," the older man assured him. "But what you did here, using the land itself as a defense, preparing without escalating, protecting without excessive force, that's what we need to learn. Not to fight, but to defend." The proposition stirred something in James. In Force Recon, part of his job had been training others to protect themselves. Maybe this wasn't so different. "The families are meeting Saturday at my place," Wilson continued. "Just to talk. Would mean a lot if you'd come, share some of your knowledge, help us protect our homes the way you protected yours." James looked out over his fields, remembering how it felt to defend them. "I'll think about it." Wilson stood, gripping his cane. "That's all I ask. You know, my grandfather used to say that farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was about being a steward of the land, protecting it for future generations. What you did here, son, you proved that's still true." As Wilson's truck disappeared down the driveway, James reflected on his words. He'd come back to Shadow Creek Farm seeking peace, but maybe peace wasn't just about avoiding conflict. Maybe it was about helping others find their own strength. His phone buzzed. A text from Sheriff Wheeler. "Got reports of suspicious activity near the Wilson place. Might be nothing, but thought you should know." James smiled slightly. The Red Scorpions had taught him something important, that his military skills and farming life didn't have to be separate. They could work together, protecting not just his land, but helping others protect theirs. Walking to his barn, James began making notes. If he was going to teach other farmers to defend their land, they'd need to understand the principles that had served him so well. Preparation, intelligence gathering, using the environment, non-violent resolution when possible. The sun was setting over Shadow Creek Farm, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. James stood on his porch, watching the colors fade. He'd found his peace here, defending his family's legacy. Now maybe it was time to help others find theirs. Tomorrow he'd call Wilson and accept his invitation. The ghost farmer had more work to do, and this time, it wasn't just about protecting his own land. It was about teaching others to become stewards of their own destiny. As night fell over the farm, James felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over him. Some battles were fought with weapons, others with wisdom. And sometimes, the quietest farmers were the ones who could teach the most powerful lessons. The Saturday morning dawned bright and clear as James Morrison pulled his pickup truck onto the Wilson farm. The property was impressive. Sprawling fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with modern agricultural equipment and well-maintained buildings. In the main yard, 15 trucks were already parked. Their owners gathered in small groups near a large red barn. Frank Wilson stood waiting, his cane tapping against the gravel as he greeted each arrival. The elderly farmer's face lit up when he saw James. "Glad you came, son. Got quite a turnout. Folks are eager to learn." James surveyed the gathered farmers. They were a diverse group, men and women of various ages, all bearing the hallmarks of their profession: weathered faces, sturdy builds, and watchful eyes. These were people who understood the value of hard work and protecting what was theirs. "Before we start," Wilson announced to the group, "I want everyone to understand something. We're not here to learn violence or start fights. We're here to learn protection, from a man who showed us that defending our land doesn't mean losing our principles." The farmers gathered in the barn, where Wilson had set up chairs in a semicircle. James stood before them, feeling oddly comfortable despite the attention. It reminded him of briefing his teams before missions, only now his audience wore flannel and denim instead of combat gear. "First principle," James began, his voice carrying clearly through the barn. "Your land is your advantage. Every field, every building, every piece of equipment can be part of your defense. The key is understanding how to use what you already have." He pulled out a map of a typical farm layout. "Take your irrigation systems. They're not just for watering crops. Properly timed, they can create obstacles, limit access routes, even disorient trespassers. The Red Scorpions learned that the hard way." The farmers leaned forward, taking notes as James explained how to transform their everyday farming equipment into defensive assets. He showed them how to position equipment to create choke points, how to use lighting to their advantage, and how to establish observation posts using existing structures. "Second principle," James continued, "intelligence gathering. Notice patterns. Document everything. Your phone is your best weapon. Record suspicious activities, take photos, note times and dates. Evidence is what turns trespassers into criminals in the eyes of the law. Sarah Henderson, a tough-looking woman in her 40s, raised her hand. What about when they come at night? Had some trouble with vandals last month. Couldn't get clear pictures in the dark. James nodded. Good question. Let me show you some techniques for night documentation that I learned in Force Recon. He proceeded to demonstrate methods for using available light, positioning cameras effectively, and creating light traps that would catch intruders off guard. As the morning wore on, James covered more advanced topics: communication systems, coordinated response plans, and nonviolent confrontation techniques. The farmers absorbed everything, asking intelligent questions and sharing their own experiences. Remember, James emphasized, the goal isn't to fight. It's to make your property too difficult a target. Most criminals look for easy opportunities. Show them there's nothing easy about your farm and they'll usually move on. During a lunch break, Wilson pulled James aside. You're doing good work here, son. These folks needed this, not just the knowledge, but the confidence. Knowing they can protect their land without becoming what they're fighting against. James watched the farmers discussing what they'd learned, already planning how to implement the strategies on their own properties. It reminded him of his days training local forces overseas. Giving people the tools to protect themselves was always more effective than fighting their battles for them. Last principle, James announced as they reconvened. Community defense. Each of your farms is part of a larger network. Share information, watch out for each other, coordinate your responses. A strong community is harder to target than isolated farms. He helped them set up a secure messaging system for sharing alerts and information. By late afternoon, they had established a robust network covering most of the county's agricultural land. As the session wound down, the farmers gathered around James, expressing their gratitude. Many shared stories of previous encounters with criminals or aggressive developers, their voices now carrying new confidence in their ability to handle future threats. This isn't about becoming vigilantes, James reminded them. It's about being prepared, being smart, and being united. Your strength comes from working together and using what you already have. Wilson stood at the barn door, watching his fellow farmers leave with new purpose. You've given us something valuable today, Morrison. Not just tactics, but hope. The ghost farmer's lessons won't be forgotten. As James drove home that evening, he reflected on the day's events. He'd come to Shadow Creek Farm seeking peace, but maybe this was the peace he was meant to find. Not just protecting his own land, but helping others protect theirs, using his military experience to preserve a way of life worth defending. The sun was setting over his cornfields when he pulled into his driveway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, James Morrison, the ghost farmer, had helped plant seeds of resilience that would grow stronger than any threat facing his community. Over the next month, reports of thwarted criminal activities began filtering in from across the county. James received regular updates from the network of farmers he'd trained, each success story confirming that his lessons had taken root. The ghost farmer's methods were proving effective far beyond Shadow Creek Farm. Late one evening, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sarah Henderson. Suspicious activity at Wilson's farm. Multiple vehicles, no lights, need your expertise. James was already moving before he finished reading the message. Frank Wilson's farm was one of the largest and most isolated in the county, making it a tempting target. Within minutes, he was in his truck, driving the back roads he'd memorized during his training sessions. As he approached Wilson's property, James killed his headlights and parked in a pre-designated observation point. Through his night vision monocular, he spotted what had triggered Sarah's alert. 3 black SUVs parked behind Wilson's eastern barn, their occupants moving with practiced coordination. These aren't ordinary criminals, James muttered to himself, recognizing their tactical movement patterns. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to the farmers' network. Professional crew at Wilson's. Implement pattern Delta. Within moments, lights began coming on at neighboring farms, creating a perimeter of illumination that would make escape more difficult. James had trained them well. The response was coordinated and precise, just as he'd taught them. Moving silently through the darkness, James made his way closer to Wilson's barn. He could hear voices now, speaking in hushed tones with city accents. This wasn't a gang or random criminals. This was something else entirely. "Check the house," a voice commanded. "The old man has to have the papers somewhere. The developer needs that land survey by tomorrow." James's jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors about aggressive developers trying to force local farmers out, but this was the first concrete evidence. He activated his phone's recording function, capturing their conversation. Suddenly, Wilson's security system, upgraded after James's training session, sprang to life. Floodlights illuminated the area, and the sound of farm equipment starting up echoed across the property. The intruders froze, momentarily confused by the coordinated response. "What the hell?" one of them shouted. "This wasn't in the intel." James smiled in the darkness. They hadn't expected farmers to be this prepared. As the intruders scrambled to regroup, he noticed something interesting. They moved like private security contractors, probably hired by the developer to obtain documents through less than legal means. More lights were coming on now, as neighboring farmers implemented the defensive strategies they'd practiced. Vehicles could be heard approaching, on multiple access roads, the community responding as one, just as they'd trained. "Abort," the leader called out. "This isn't worth the risk. Back to the vehicles." But retreat wouldn't be as simple as they thought. James had helped Wilson modify his irrigation system for just such occasions. With a remote signal, the sprinklers activated, creating a maze of wet, muddy patches between the intruders and their vehicles. James watched as the professional crew struggled through the obstacles. Their tactical training was useless against farmers who had learned to use their land as a weapon. One by one, they slipped and stumbled, their coordinated retreat dissolving into chaos. Sheriff Wheeler's patrol car arrived just as the last SUV was trying to navigate the muddy access road. Its tires spun uselessly in the thick soil, exactly as James had planned when he'd helped Wilson modify that particular stretch of ground. "Evening, boys," the sheriff called out, his spotlight illuminating the stuck vehicle. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" The occupants had no choice but to surrender. James emerged from his hiding spot, phone in hand with the recorded evidence. The intruders' faces showed shocked recognition. They hadn't expected to encounter the legendary ghost farmer here. "Professional crew," James reported to the sheriff. "Probably ex-military or private security. They were after Wilson's land survey documents." "Developers getting desperate," Sheriff Wheeler nodded. "Hiring contractors to do their dirty work now. This evidence should be interesting to the state investigators." Frank Wilson appeared on his porch, leaning on his cane but standing tall. "Guess those lessons paid off, Morrison," he called out. "Don't think these fellows expected farmers to be so well prepared." As the sheriff's deputies processed the scene, James looked around at the gathered farmers who had responded to the alert. They stood confident and united, no longer easy targets for those who would threaten their way of life. "The ghost farmer strikes again," Sarah Henderson commented, coming to stand beside him. "Though I guess it's not just one ghost anymore. It's all of us." James nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. He'd taught them well, helped them transform their peaceful farms into protective sanctuaries. The developers and their hired guns had learned a valuable lesson tonight. Sometimes the quietest farmers were the ones you had to watch out for most. The morning sun would rise on a community that was stronger, more unified, and better prepared than ever before. And somewhere in the heart of it all, Shadow Creek Farm stood as a testament to the power of one farmer's decision to use his skills not just for himself, but for all those who worked the land. 2 days after the incident at Wilson's farm, James Morrison sat in a crowded courthouse, watching as the captured contractors appeared before the judge. The evidence he'd gathered had opened a much larger investigation, revealing a complex web of corruption and illegal tactics used by developers to force farmers off their land. "The state is pursuing multiple charges," District Attorney Sarah Martinez explained to the assembled farmers during a break in the proceedings. "Attempted burglary, criminal trespassing, conspiracy. And that's just the beginning. The FBI is looking into the developer's entire operation now." James observed the proceedings quietly, noting how different these opponents looked in daylight and handcuffs. Their tactical gear and professional demeanor had been replaced by prison jumpsuits and defeated expressions. They hadn't expected their routine intimidation job to result in federal attention. "Mr. Morrison," the DA continued, turning to face him, "your recording was crucial. Without it, this might have been written off as another simple trespassing case. Instead, we're looking at potential RICO charges against the entire development company." Frank Wilson sat beside James, his cane resting against the courtroom bench. "Told you he was the right man for the job," the elderly farmer said proudly. "The ghost farmers got a way of bringing things into the light." After the hearing, James walked out to find a group of reporters waiting. Word had spread about how a group of farmers had outsmarted a professional tactical team, and the media was hungry for details. But James simply walked past them, leaving Sheriff Wheeler to handle the press. "You know," Wilson said as they left the courthouse, "what happened at my farm wasn't just about stopping some contractors. It was about showing everyone that farmers aren't helpless. We can protect our own if we're smart about it." James nodded, thinking about how far they'd come. The network he'd helped create now covered 3 counties, with farmers sharing information, coordinating responses, and standing united against those who would threaten their way of life. Back at Shadow Creek Farm, James found Sarah Henderson waiting on his porch. She'd become one of his most dedicated students, quickly grasping the principles he'd taught and adapting them to her own property. "Got word from the northern farmers," she reported. 2 more development companies have withdrawn their offers after hearing what happened at Wilson's. Seems nobody wants to risk running into the ghost farmers network. James smiled slightly. "Good. That's how it should work. Prevention, not confrontation." They walked together across his property, discussing recent improvements to the farmers' communication system. Sarah had used her technology background to create a secure alert network that could mobilize the entire farming community within minutes. "You know," she said, pausing near the barn, "when I first heard about what you did to the red scorpions, I thought it was just luck. But now I understand. It's about being smarter, not stronger. About using what we have instead of trying to match force with force." The sun was setting over the cornfields, casting long shadows across the land that James had fought so hard to protect. But now it wasn't just his land. It was part of something larger, a community of farmers who had learned to stand together. The developers, the gangs, the criminals, Sarah continued, they all made the same mistake. They thought farmers were easy targets because we're peaceful. They never understood that being peaceful doesn't mean being weak. James looked out over his fields, remembering the night he'd faced down the red scorpions. That confrontation had started something bigger than he'd ever imagined, a movement that had transformed an entire farming community from potential victims into capable defenders of their way of life. "You've done more than teach us tactics," Sarah said softly. "You've helped us find our strength. The ghost farmer might have started with you, but now it's become something bigger. A symbol that reminds everyone that sometimes the quietest people are the ones you shouldn't underestimate." As darkness settled over Shadow Creek Farm, James thought about his journey. He'd come here seeking peace after years of combat, only to find that true peace sometimes meant being ready to defend what mattered most. The skills he'd learned in Force Recon hadn't been left behind. They'd been transformed, used to protect rather than attack, to defend rather than destroy. The ghost farmer's legend had grown, but more importantly, it had evolved. It was no longer just about one veteran who had outsmarted a biker gang. It was about a community that had learned to stand together, using wisdom instead of weapons, preparation instead of force, unity instead of fear. And somewhere in the heart of farm country, Shadow Creek Farm stood as a reminder that sometimes the most effective defenders were those who worked the land with quiet strength and unwavering determination. A month after the courthouse proceedings, Shadow Creek Farm hosted an unusual gathering. Farmers from across 3 counties had come together, not for training or emergency response, but to celebrate their transformed community. Tables laden with home-cooked food stretched across James Morrison's front yard, while children played near the barn that had once been a battleground. "Never thought I'd see anything like this," Sheriff Wheeler remarked, standing beside James on the porch. Used to be every farmer for themselves. Now look at them, organized, united, watching out for each other. You did that, Morrison. James shook his head slightly. They did it themselves. I just showed them what was possible. Frank Wilson's truck pulled up, and several younger farmers rushed to help the elderly man out. He moved slower these days, but his eyes were bright with pride as he surveyed the gathering. The attempted raid on his farm had become a turning point, proof that even the most professional adversaries couldn't overcome a prepared and united community. Got some news, Wilson announced as he joined them on the porch. State legislatures considering a new bill, stronger protections for agricultural land against aggressive development tactics. They're calling it the Ghost Farmer Act, unofficially. Sarah Henderson approached, carrying a newspaper. Have you seen this? She asked, handing it to James. The headline read, Rural crime rates plummet as farmer network expands. Below was a photo of farmland at night, illuminated by strategic lighting systems James had helped design. It's not just about stopping criminals anymore, Sarah continued. We're changing how people think about farming communities. We're not victims or easy targets. We're organized, prepared, and united. The afternoon wore on, and James found himself surrounded by stories of success. One farmer described thwarting cattle rustlers using the surveillance techniques he'd taught them. Another spoke of developers backing off when they realized the community could mobilize faster than their hired intimidators could act. Remember when you first trained us? A young farmer named Mike Thompson asked. Some of us thought you were paranoid with all the preparation and documentation. Nobody thinks that anymore. Being ready isn't paranoid, it's smart farming. As the sun began to set, the gathering moved to the barn for what had become a tradition, strategy sharing. Farmers took turns discussing new security innovations they'd developed, adapting James's military techniques to their specific needs. Modified my irrigation system like you showed us, one farmer explained. Last week, some guys in a cargo van tried to case my property. Got stuck in the mud so bad they had to wait for the sheriff to pull them out. Had a similar situation, another added. Used those light positioning techniques you taught us. Anyone trying to sneak around at night gets lit up like a Christmas tree. Haven't had a single problem since we installed it. James listened with satisfaction. They'd taken his basic lessons and evolved them, creating a security network that was both sophisticated and simple, effective without being aggressive. The Ghost Farmer's methods had taken root and grown into something far beyond his original teachings. Later that evening, as the gathering wound down, Frank Wilson called for everyone's attention. Year ago, we were all fighting our own battles, he began, losing ground to gangs, developers, criminals who thought farmers were easy marks. Then the Ghost Farmer showed us another way. Wilson gestured to James. But what Morrison really taught us wasn't just about defense. It was about community, about standing together, about using our strengths instead of trying to match our enemies' weaknesses. The old farmer's voice carried across the quiet gathering. We work the land. We know its rhythms, its patterns, its power. Morrison showed us how to use that knowledge not just for growing crops, but for protecting our way of life. Sarah Henderson stood up. The Ghost Farmer's legend grew because it wasn't just about one man anymore. It became about all of us. Every farmer who stands watch, every field that becomes a defense, every community that refuses to be victimized. James looked out over the assembled faces, men and women who had transformed from potential victims into capable defenders of their land and lifestyle. His military training had found a new purpose, not in combat, but in empowering others to protect what mattered most. As night fell over Shadow Creek Farm, the gathering slowly dispersed, each farmer returning to their own protected piece of land. The Ghost Farmer's legacy had evolved beyond one veteran's stand against a biker gang. It had become a symbol of rural resilience, of quiet strength, of a community that had learned to defend itself without losing its soul. And somewhere in the darkness, James Morrison smiled, knowing that his search for peace had led him to something even more valuable: the chance to help others find their own strength, their own peace. their own way of standing tall on the land they loved. In the pre-dawn hours of an autumn morning, James Morrison stood on his porch at Shadow Creek Farm, watching the sun rise over fields that held more stories than most would ever know. A year had passed since his first encounter with the red scorpions, and the landscape before him had transformed in ways that went far beyond the changing seasons. His phone buzzed. Another success story from the network. A group of farmers in the next county had peacefully turned away a development company's hired intimidators, simply by demonstrating their preparedness. No confrontation needed. The mere knowledge of the ghost farmers network had been enough. "Caught them surveying our back fields," the message read. "Activated the response plan just like you taught us. They were gone within 10 minutes. Guess your reputation precedes you, ghost farmer." James smiled, remembering how it all began. What started as one veteran protecting his land had grown into something that was reshaping rural life across 3 states. The lawyers and development companies had learned an expensive lesson. Farmers were no longer easy targets. Sheriff Wheeler's patrol car pulled up the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires. The sheriff had become a regular visitor, not to respond to trouble, but to share news of how the farming community's transformation had made his job easier. "Morning, Morrison," Wheeler called out, climbing from his car with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you'd want to hear the latest. Remember those contractors we arrested at Wilson's place? Federal investigation just expanded to include 3 more development companies. Seems they were all using the same playbook." James accepted the coffee, its warmth welcome in the cool morning air. "How's Frank doing?" "Wilson? Stubborn as ever. His testimony before the state legislature last week got a standing ovation. Never seen politicians pay such close attention to a farmer before." They walked together toward the barn, the same barn where James had first demonstrated that being peaceful didn't mean being powerless. Inside, the space had been converted into a community center of sorts, where farmers gathered to share knowledge and strategy. "Got something else you should see," Wheeler said, pulling out his tablet. "Satellite images of county farmland from last year compared to now. See these patterns?" He pointed to systematic changes in field layouts and equipment positioning. "Your defensive techniques are actually visible from space." James studied the images. Farmers had adapted his military training in ways he never expected, turning their entire properties into sophisticated defensive networks while maintaining their primary purpose: growing food for a hungry nation. "They're calling it agricultural security integration now," Wheeler continued. "Some universities want to study it. Turns out your methods not only deter criminals, but also improve farm efficiency. Who knew military tactics could make better farmers?" A truck appeared on the horizon, Sarah Henderson's vehicle. She'd taken the lead in expanding the network, teaching new communities the principles James had shared. Under her guidance, the system had evolved beyond simple defense into a model of rural cooperation. "Got the latest network statistics," Sarah announced as she approached. "Criminal activity down 85% across protected areas. Insurance rates dropping for participating farms. 3 more counties requesting training programs." James listened as they shared updates, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal pride. The ghost farmer had become more than a legend. It was a blueprint for community empowerment, showing how preparation and unity could accomplish what force and violence never could. "You know what impresses me most?" Sheriff Wheeler mused. "Haven't had to make a single arrest on protected farmland in 4 months. The serious troublemakers don't even try anymore. Your reputation does all the work." Sarah nodded. "It's like you always said. The best defense is making them decide you're not worth the trouble. The ghost farmer taught us that strength isn't about fighting. It's about being so well prepared that fighting becomes unnecessary." As morning fully arrived, casting long shadows across his fields, James thought about his journey. He'd come to Shadow Creek Farm seeking escape from his military past, only to find that those same skills, properly adapted, could build something truly meaningful. The ghost farmer's legacy wasn't in victories won or enemies defeated. It was in the quiet strength of farmers standing together, in fields made secure through wisdom rather than weapons, in communities that had learned to protect themselves while staying true to their peaceful nature. Looking out over his land, James Morrison, The veteran who became a farmer who became a legend knew he had finally found what he'd been searching for. Not just peace for himself, but the satisfaction of helping others find their own quiet strength, their own way of standing tall on the land they loved. And somewhere in the heart of farm country, Shadow Creek Farm stood as a testament to an enduring truth, that sometimes the most powerful forces weren't those that destroyed, but those that protected, preserved, and brought people together in defense of something worth saving. The winter wind howled across Shadow Creek Farm, but inside the newly expanded barn, warmth and purpose filled the air. James Morrison stood before a group of 30 farmers who had traveled from 5 different states, each seeking to learn the methods that had transformed their profession's vulnerability into strength. 6 months ago, a farmer from Kansas began, "We were losing land left and right to intimidation tactics. Now, thanks to what you all taught us, we haven't had a single incident in our county. The ghost farmer's methods work." James surveyed the gathered faces, weathered, determined, and now confident. The training center they'd established at Shadow Creek Farm had become more than just a place to learn security techniques. It had become a symbol of rural empowerment, a place where farmers discovered their own strength. "Got something to show you," Frank Wilson called out, making his way through the crowd with surprising energy for his age. He spread a map across the central table, a patchwork of highlighted areas spanning multiple states. Green shows protected farms. Yellow shows areas requesting to join the network. Red shows trouble spots we're monitoring. Sarah Henderson stepped forward, pointing to various locations. Patterns clear now. Criminal organizations, aggressive developers. They're actively avoiding areas where ghost farmer protocols are in place. They've learned it's not worth the effort. The barn doors opened, admitting Sheriff Wheeler and 2 men in suits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wheeler announced, "these are agents from the FBI's Rural Crime Division. They're here to study what you've created. Seems the ghost farmer's approach is drawing national attention." James listened as the agents explained their interest. The dramatic drop in rural crime rates across protected areas had caught the attention of law enforcement nationwide. What had started as one veteran protecting his farm had evolved into a model for rural security that challenged traditional thinking. "Your methods are unique," one agent noted, reviewing the statistics. "Nonviolent, preventive, community-based. You've achieved what increased patrols and traditional law enforcement couldn't: genuine rural security." A young farmer raised her hand. "But it's more than just security, isn't it? Since implementing these systems, our whole community has changed. We work together better. We're more efficient. We're stronger." James nodded. "That's because true security isn't just about keeping threats out. It's about building something worth protecting together." The afternoon session focused on advanced techniques, new applications of James's military experience adapted for agricultural settings. Farmers shared innovations they'd developed, each contributing to the evolution of the ghost farmer's methods. "Modified the irrigation system like you taught," one farmer explained, showing photos. "Not just for defense now. Improved our crop yields by 30%. Turns out thinking tactically makes for better farming." As evening approached, Sarah presented the latest network expansion plans. The ghost farmers' influence had grown far beyond their initial goals, spreading through rural communities like roots through fertile soil. "We're not just protecting farms anymore," she explained. "We're preserving a way of life, showing that farmers don't have to choose between being peaceful and being strong." Later, as the gathering wound down, Frank Wilson pulled James aside. "Remember when you first came back to Shadow Creek Farm? Looking for peace after all those years at war? Found something better, didn't you?" James looked out over his snow-covered fields, thinking about the transformation he'd witnessed. Found out peace isn't just about being left alone. Sometimes it's about helping others find their strength. The FBI agents approached for a final word. "What you've created here, Mr. Morrison, it's remarkable. A complete rethinking of rural security. Would you be willing to help develop training programs for other regions?" James smiled slightly. "That's already happening. Every farmer here is a teacher now. The ghost farmer isn't just one person anymore. It's an idea, a method, a community." As night fell over Shadow Creek Farm, the visitors departed, each carrying with them not just techniques and tactics, but a deeper understanding of true strength. The legend of the ghost farmer had grown far beyond its origins, becoming a blueprint for how communities could protect themselves while staying true to their values. James stood on his porch, watching the last vehicles disappear into the winter darkness. His search for peace had led him down an unexpected path. But looking at what had grown from those first seeds of resistance, he knew he'd found something far more valuable than simple solitude. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and James Morrison, the veteran who became a farmer who became a legend, smiled. The ghost farmer's greatest victory hadn't been in defeating enemies, but in showing others how to stand tall, stand together, and protect what mattered most without losing themselves in the process. 2 years after the Red Scorpions incident, Shadow Creek Farm had transformed into something James Morrison could never have imagined when he first returned home. The once quiet farm had become a beacon of hope and strength for rural communities across the nation, while still maintaining its peaceful essence as a working farm. On this particular spring morning, James stood in his cornfield, watching a news helicopter circle overhead. The national media had finally caught wind of the full story. How one veteran farmer's stand against a biker gang had sparked a revolution in rural security and community cooperation. "They're calling it the Ghost Farmer Revolution," Sarah Henderson said, walking up beside him with a tablet in hand. "Look at these headlines. Rural crime rates hit historic low. Farmers unite, the silent strength of America's heartland. From combat to crops. How one veteran changed rural America." James continued checking his corn sprouts, more interested in the health of his crops than the media attention. As long as they understand it's not about one person, it's about communities learning to protect themselves. Sheriff Wheeler's patrol car pulled up along the field's edge. "Got visitors coming," he announced through his open window. "Federal task force wants to study the network you've built. They're talking about implementing similar programs nationwide." "They're missing the point if they think it's something you can just implement," James replied, brushing soil from his hands. "It has to grow from the community itself." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "That's exactly what I told them, but they want to hear it from the original ghost farmer himself." Later that afternoon, James hosted a gathering in his barn, now expanded into a proper training center, while still maintaining its function for farm equipment. Representatives from various government agencies sat alongside farmers, watching as he explained the principles that had proven so effective. "The key isn't in fancy technology or aggressive tactics," James explained, standing before a map showing the network's coverage. "It's about understanding your land, working together, and being better prepared than those who might threaten you." Frank Wilson, moving slower these days but still sharp as ever, added his perspective. 2 years ago, we were all fighting our own battles, losing ground to criminals and developers. Now look at us, connected, coordinated, strong. Not because we learned to fight, but because we learned to stand together." A government analyst raised her hand. "But how do you maintain this level of coordination across such a wide area without a central command structure?" Sarah stepped forward to answer. "Because it's not a military operation. It's neighbors helping neighbors, using the land we know and love as our greatest ally. The ghost farmer showed us how to turn our peaceful nature into our strength." James watched as farmers from his network demonstrated various techniques: irrigation systems that doubled as security measures, equipment positioning that created natural barriers, communication networks that could mobilize entire communities within minutes. What had started as military tactics had evolved into something uniquely agricultural. Last month, a farmer from Oklahoma reported, "We had a group of land grabbers try to pressure elderly farmers into selling. Within an hour of their first appearance, 50 farms had activated their alert systems. The developers left without making a single offer." As evening approached, James took the federal representatives on a tour of Shadow Creek Farm. The setting sun cast long shadows across fields that had become both productive farmland and a model of rural security. "Most people see just corn and soybeans," James explained, gesturing to his crops. "But we've learned to see potential. How every field, every piece of equipment, every natural feature can help protect our way of life without compromising who we are. Standing on his porch as the visitors departed, James reflected on how far things had come. The ghost farmer's legend had grown far beyond one veteran protecting his land. It had become a movement, a philosophy, a testament to the quiet strength that had always existed in farming communities. Sarah joined him, watching the last vehicles disappear down the gravel drive. "You know what makes this work?" she asked. "It's not just the tactics or the training, it's that you showed us we didn't have to become something we're not to protect what we love." James nodded, looking out over his peaceful fields as darkness settled over Shadow Creek Farm. His search for peace after years of combat had led him to create something unprecedented, a way for peaceful people to protect themselves while staying true to their values. The ghost farmer's greatest legacy wasn't in the battles won or the criminals deterred. It was in the communities strengthened, the heritage preserved, and the proof that sometimes the quietest forces could be the most powerful. And somewhere in America's heartland, Shadow Creek Farm stood as a reminder that true strength often grew from the most peaceful soil. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.